So it's about standards and norms in palliative care, which is an example for interdisciplinary work. Hospice and palliative care is truly interdisciplinary, which I will try to show later on. And Maria, I have prepared the talk for about 45 minutes. Is that too long?
No, it's okay.
And if you're not asleep by then, I'll be very happy to discuss with you.
We have time. We have time then till 12:30 after your speech to ask questions and.
Okay, beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. Is that okay if I sit down for the Mr. Rickman? Is that okay if I sit down? Okay. So my presentation will have these parts. I would like to introduce you to the modern hospice movement, briefly introduce you to the two founders of the modern hospice movement, and then go right away into the definition of palliative care, which is already the first step into standardization. To define a certain topic is the first step into standardization. And then I would like to introduce you to the European Association for Palliative Care, which is an internationally acting organization, Europe-wide and also globally. And the European Association for Palliative Care has published a white paper on standards and norms in palliative care. I will introduce you to some aspects of this paper. I think the entire paper has about 60 pages, 40 to 60 pages, so I will not be able to cover the entire paper, but I will try to give you a feeling about what did the European Association think they need to standardize, which is very interesting to understand what people, experts in a certain field, think is worth being standardized. And then I would like to guide you through some critical voices that have been raised concerning the issue of the standardization of the hospice movement. So you might be familiar with the two founders of the modern hospice movement. They are two women that you might have heard of already. One is the Swiss psychiatrist Elisabeth Kübler-Ross, who immigrated to the United States and worked in Chicago in a psychiatric ward. She always was a revolutionary, as you can see from the quote that she is quoted with on the website. The quote is originally in German because she was Swiss German, so I have translated it. In her words is, "Ich habe das Sterben aus der Toilette geholt." This is in Swiss words, and in English that yields to, "I have pulled death and dying out of the toilet." So she was a real taboo breaker, and she was very, very successful. The lower picture shows an information campaign that took place a few years ago in Vienna. So she really was successful in breaking the taboo. It is possible to have an information campaign about hospice in Austria nowadays, which is really, we owe this to Elisabeth Kübler-Ross. And we also owe these wonderful 5 stages of loss that you have certainly read about and have certainly used in your daily practice. It has become something of everyday knowledge nowadays, which is a sign of a really strong and good theory, in my point of view, if it becomes part of the everyday's knowledge. And so Elisabeth Kübler-Ross has derived these 5 stages from interviews with dying people, which was really taboo breaking, because at her time the round, when it went through the rooms in hospital, went around the rooms where the dying people were in the beds. The round, the doctors just didn't enter the rooms where the dying people were, and Elisabeth Kübler-Ross made just the opposite. She went there and had long and very fruitful discussions with dying patients that yielded these 5 stages of loss that help all of us to understand that grief and loss are normal things. There is nothing pathological. It's a normal thing to go through these 5 stages, but not in a linear way, but back and forth and in circles, which Elisabeth Kübler-Ross herself has made clear. This is Cicely Saunders, very different person, not such a revolutionary, but an incredible innovator. She was awarded the title Dame by the Queen. She was a very spiritual person, and this is one quote from her that shows the way she enacted her spirituality. She said to the dying people, "You count because you are you, and you count until the last moment of your life." Which in 1967, when she founded the first hospice, St. Christopher's Hospice in London, was innovative in a way we can't imagine today anymore. To say you count until the last moment of your life. And she built this St. Christopher's Hospice only for dying people. A lot of volunteers and a lot of nurses and doctors helped her to care for people that died from cancer in St. Christopher's Hospice. And this is the piece of theory, the most important piece of theory that Cicely Saunders has left us, her legacy. It is drawn on her anthropology. She thinks a person has these 4 important dimensions or components, and so is pain. Pain is not only a physical issue, but it's a psychological issue, a social and a spiritual issue. So when patients suffer from pain or other symptoms, this has always a spiritual component, a social and a psychological. So this is nothing that can be alleviated with medication only. And Cicely Saunders is also quoted with that sentence. I think that's probably the best definition of pain that we can have. Pain is what the patient says hurts. It's not what the experts think, it's what the patient says hurts. So if a patient says, "I'm in pain," there cannot be any expert to say, "This is not possible." According to Cicely Saunders, this is not possible to say you cannot be in pain if a patient says he or she is in pain. So, palliative care stands on the shoulders of many pioneers, of which I have shown you the pictures of 2. Of the 2 women that I consider to be the founders of the modern hospice movement. And Cicely Saunders stated that her philosophy and her ideas were completely integrated into the official definition of palliative care that was issued by the World Health Organization in the year 1990, which is 23 years after the foundation of the first hospice. So it took 23 years to issue an official definition of palliative care, and this one was issued by the World Health Organization and is now world famous, I would say, and is the first step to defining norms and standards. So let me briefly introduce you through what the World Health Organization says is the official and correct definition of palliative care. The one I'm quoting here was amended in the year 2002, and that is still the one that is valid. And it starts with saying that palliative care is an approach that improves the quality of life of patients and their families. And that in itself is already innovative, because it's about quality of life and not about prolonging life. So it's not about cure, it's about palliative care, it's about dignity and quality of life. And the other innovation is that palliative care always looks at the system. Palliative care says it's not only the patients who are suffering, it's the patients and their caregivers and their families. And the definition continues and says palliative care is the right approach when patients are faced with life-threatening illness. That means not only in their last days, it's not an terminal care, not an end-of-life care. It takes place when life-threatening illness is diagnosed. And in our words, and I'm following here the Marina Koya, who founded Palliative Geriatrics, an Austrian, and she says, in her words, dementia is incurable. So palliative care is an approach for disoriented old people, because the disorientation cannot be cured. It will not go away. It will stay until the end of life. So palliative care is also a valid approach for disoriented old people. Some more aspects about the definition of palliative care that is groundbreaking. The definition of palliative care says that dying is a normal process, and we will get back to this. Normal processes don't require experts and don't require only professionals. If it's a normal part of life, it should be possible by everybody, every citizen, to deal with death and dying, and every person who is dying to deal with her own death and dying. It should not be compulsory that professionals, or especially medical professions, be present when it's about dying. And nowadays, very important, palliative care intends neither to hasten nor to postpone death, which is a really important ethical dilemma that is embedded in this saying, because to hasten death would mean euthanasia. And palliative care is an approach that claims to prevent euthanasia. If your suffering is cared for well enough, if you count until the end of your life, as Cicely Saunders say, your cry for euthanasia diminishes. If you feel that some people will hear when your suffering is unbearable and will care for you and will help to alleviate your symptoms, you need not scream for euthanasia. And something that might be also very important for you as validation teachers, it's an interdisciplinary approach. Palliative care uses a team approach. It's only possible to perform palliative care in a team. You need doctors, nurses, psychologists, social workers, chaplains, physiotherapists. These are the professions that are standardized and normed to be part of the palliative care team. So we can always discuss about whether standardizing the professions that form the palliative care team is the right thing, whether it leaves us enough freedom and enough possibilities to respond to the patient's needs, if the professions that are part of the palliative care team are standardized. Will it then still be possible to bring in other professions if the patient needs it? So this is the definition of hospice and palliative care. I hope I could make that clear what kind of an approach it is. If you have questions, if I was not clear enough, I'd be happy to take them. Please interrupt me if there's something on your mind now, because I mean this is a heavy piece of theory. So if there are any remarks, resonances, please just stop me from talking. Otherwise, I will continue, and whenever the questions come to your mind, please be so kind and share them with me. When we want to talk about standardization in palliative care, we need to get to know the body or the association that feels in charge of doing these norms and standardizations. And for Europe, it's the European Association for Palliative Care, which nowadays is a large non-governmental organization, was founded in 1988. The head office now is in Milan in Italy, which has to do with the founders of the European Palliative Care Association. And in 2015, this year, I will call it EAPC, that's what we say for European Association for Palliative Care, we call it the EAPC, has individual members from 48 nations across the world and collective members from 56 national associations in 32 European countries. So although it's called the European Association for Palliative Care, it has members from all around the world, especially the Canadians and the Australians. They rather trust the Europeans, the UK people, than the Asians or the Americans. So we have large congresses. The EAPC holds large congresses with 2,000 participants around every other year, and many of them are Canadian and Australian. So the EAPC brings together many voices, every other year 2,000 voices, and the idea is to forge a vision of excellency. There's already the issue of norms and standards. It has to do with a vision of excellency. But the EAPC still says it's not the vision of excellency that experts define, but it's the vision of excellency that meets the needs of patients and their families. And in their mission, the EAPC says it's about developing and promoting palliative care in Europe through information, education, and research. And there are more aims and objectives to the European Association of Palliative Care. I just want to highlight a few ones. One is that the EAPC feels in charge at a scientific, a clinical, and a social, societal level. And maybe the last aim and objective is the one that deals the most with standards and norms. So I will read that one to you. I have highlighted it in red. So this is not part of the aims and objectives at their webpage, but I have highlighted in red the access to best palliative care possible to all patients who need it within health care and social systems. That's the aim and objective of the European Association for Palliative Care, and there's a lot of standardization and norms embedded already in these aims and objectives. In the year 2009, there has been conducted an expert process that was started with the board members of the European Association of Palliative Care, but was widened from there. And through this expert process that was called Delphi process, this is a way of getting back and forth with certain statements to the a Delphi process means that you give certain statements to experts and you ask them whether these experts think these statements are true or not, and you do that back and forth in several loops. And through this Delphi process, the white paper on standards and norms for palliative care in Europe was developed in the years 2009 and 2010. It was published in 2 parts in the European Journal of Palliative Care, which is the official journal of the European Association for Palliative Care. And it covers several pages, as you can see here. 278 until 289 is the first part, and page 22 to 33 is the second part. of the standards and norms that have been published. In this paper, they state that the paper is about norms on structural quality for the provision of palliative care. That's the overall aim of this white paper on standards and norms. It is to yield structural quality for the provision of palliative care. But as you will soon see through the index that I will show you, they have covered many other issues in this paper, not only structural quality. Issues that I will be happy to discuss with you whether they lend themselves to be standardized. In this paper, which I find interesting, they differentiate between norms and standards. And the experts that have published this paper have decided to go for standards and not for norms. I don't know in which way you have discussed this. I have learned from this paper that norms are something I think I got that wrong. They went for norms in this paper and not for standards. I'm sorry, I got that wrong. Because norms are a consensus of quality goals that you aim for. So that means that's something you aim for and you don't compulsorily have to reach it. So they have decided for norms. Whereas standards, this is what they state in this paper, are a cut-off limit. And you must not go below these standards if you want to have quality. So in this paper they say norms are more soft than standards, because you always try to improve in the direction of norms, whereas with standards you always have to make sure you don't get below the cutoff point. So we're talking about norms here. So what did they standardize in this paper? They did not only standardize the structural quality, although this is what they stated, but then when you look closer at the paper, they standardized definition and terminology. They standardized common values and philosophy. And I want you to listen very carefully to that. This paper standardizes common values and philosophy. And I hope I can give you a little insight on how this paper thinks this works. It standardizes levels of care, patient groups, and services and settings. So first thing is, when you want to standardize something like palliative care, you need to define the terminology. So in this paper you find the definition of palliative care, of hospice care, of supportive care, end-of-life care, terminal care and respite care, which all sound very similar, but they have come up in this paper with a very subtle definition of each of these terms. And then they go on in standardizing philosophy, common values and principles. And as a first step they standardize autonomy. And I want to discuss this with you if I find it, because I find that very worthwhile discussing. In this paper they say the intrinsic value of each person as an autonomous and unique individual is acknowledged and respected. Care is only provided when the patient or family are prepared to accept it. Ideally, the patient preserves his/her self-determination regarding the power of decision on place of care, treatment options, and access to specialist palliative care. So this is autonomy standardized. I would have to read it to you 3 or 4 more times to understand, but I just wanted to highlight the principle. And I think that we're facing a real dilemma here. I think I hold it with the Austrian Carinthian philosopher Peter Heindl, who diagnoses that our society is much too much in love with autonomy. Autonomy is a much too strongly emphasized value in our society and has yielded to some serious problems in palliative care. The fact that all is about autonomy, and in my critical voice I would say the fact that autonomy is standardized as a compulsory value in this paper has yielded to some serious problems in palliative care. Because the closer you get to the end of life, the more you depend on others. So our autonomy is always relational. It is already now that we can sit here, give an input, sit here and listen, go to an interesting teachers' meeting. Already now we depend on each other for being able to exercise this autonomy. It is even more the case when you are at the end of your life. So if you want to standardize autonomy, that's my opinion, you always need to standardize it as a relational issue. Autonomy can only be realized in relations. If you don't do so, that yields to the right of suicide, something we witness in our days. The cries for the right of suicide become louder. And I think they are a real problem because it's only a very small step from the right to suicide to the obligation to suicide, especially for disoriented old people. And I think we need to fight this. And so I think we need to be very critical about papers that standardize autonomy and only autonomy, and that don't acknowledge that when we care for disoriented old people, when we care for people at the end of their lives, autonomy is always relational. I get carried away a little bit with this, so I have to be a little bit quicker about the rest of the paper. It standardizes the level of care at which palliative care has to be delivered. It says there need to be 4 levels at which palliative care needs to be delivered, and in the further run of the paper it emphasizes only at point 3 the specialist palliative care. That is standardized in the rest of the paper. And this is the way it is standardized. The part 2 of the paper standardizes specialist palliative care services. And to give you an idea about specialist palliative care services, these are, for example, palliative care units at hospitals, palliative care wards, which you all might be familiar with. Have you ever encountered at the closest hospital to you a palliative care ward? Nowadays many hospitals have something like this. A special ward where that cares for the dying people. Another specialist palliative care service is the hospice, like the one that Cicely Saunders has founded in 1967. We have 2 such hospices in Austria nowadays. We have many more palliative care units. And there is palliative care support teams. There's a definition in this paper of palliative care support teams. These are like flying teams that go from ward to ward and give support to the professionals there. There's also standardization of the home palliative care team in this paper, of volunteer hospice teams, of a day hospice, and of palliative care outpatient clinics. And just to give you an idea about what is there to standardize about specialist palliative care services, you can define it. So you can define what is a palliative care unit, and the definition in this paper says it's a ward in hospital that is specialized in the treatment of palliative care patients. This is standardized and defined in this paper. And then it says what is the aim of a palliative care unit. The aim is to alleviate discomfort and to allow for discharge. And this is very important. Palliative care units only keep patients for about 2 weeks, and after these 2 weeks the dying patients need to find another place where they are cared for, and this is defined in this paper. And it also defines the population-based demand, and this paper says there need to be 50 palliative care unit beds per 1 million inhabitants in all of Europe. And we are about at that level now. In Austria, we have about 50 palliative care unit beds for 1 million inhabitants. But now they're increasing the threshold. So now you find publications where they say you need 80 specialized palliative care beds in palliative care units. So you can, there's always growth possible. And this is something that comes with standardization. But as a means in itself, you cannot prevent it. Growth is embedded in standardization, because if you have such a wonderful standardized thing, you want the whole world to benefit from it, and you want more people to get access to this wonderful standardized palliative care unit, so you need to increase the thresholds. And you need more money and more specialized professionals. And then it says who should work at the palliative care ward. That's standardized also. It should be a highly qualified multidisciplinary team that has a specialist training. The core team should consist of doctors and nurses, and then there are these other professions that should be part of the palliative care ward team that are standardized as well. So I hope this was not too far away from your experience as validation teachers, and I hope very much that I was able to lay the ground now to discuss some critical voices with you about standardization in palliative care. Maria, what's the message?
Yes, I think first of all you have to have an applause for that, what you said.
Thank you. Thank you, Maria.
I liked it so much because it's coming your voices. I like your voice, you see, because it gives some expression of the background on which you are researching and working. Also, because we are in validation looking for voices or hearing voices. And my question would be, could you make some connections between validation? You did some, but maybe why it could be interesting that we, that maybe palliative care can profit from validation or opposite?
Oh yes, I think, thank you very much, Maria, for this question. I think there is a lot, many ways in which palliative care and validation can profit from each other, or in which people that are concerned by disorientation can profit from both approaches. As I already mentioned, palliative care takes place when there is life-threatening illness. Although I myself don't consider to be disoriented to be an illness, but in a way you can still say it's incurable. And to lose orientation is a major loss in my experience, and I hope you would agree with this. And palliative care is an approach that deals with losses, with grief, with bereavement. And I think disoriented old people experience incredible losses. And they experience them several times a day sometimes, as Maria has taught me. Disoriented old people go through their losses several times a day because they don't remember that they have gone through the loss at the same a few hours ago. So they keep, you need, if the mother died, you need to tell that to a person, disoriented person, several times a day, and every time she mourns, she's in grief, every time you tell her that her mother died. And palliative care is an approach that can help with loss and grief through the stages of Elisabeth Kübler-Ross, for instance. If you are aware of these stages, you can understand that disoriented old people go through these stages every time they experience the loss again. And also pain and symptom management is very important in palliative care, and it is a very important thing if somebody cannot express herself in the way we do. If she expresses herself in her own world, in her own dementia world, I hope I use the right terms, then you need people who know how to validate, to understand if somebody is experiencing pain. So we in palliative care, we urgently need validation, this ability to communicate with disoriented old people. Otherwise we will never understand whether they experience pain, and then we cannot do a good pain management.
Thank you for that. And I, because of my sight handicap, were not aware that you have not finished your speech already. So I'm sorry for interrupting you. But maybe it helps also that we just said it now.
I'm very happy to be interrupted, also by not only by Maria. But do you see any connections between palliative care and validation? As
Petra will take the microphone, the second one, and we'll have a look if somebody wants to say something.
I think that validation is a palliative care communication method for people in 4 phases of resolution. Like Naomi Feil defined the disoriented process in the old age. And I believe there are also, I think what I know from palliative care is that if an oriented person dies, she or he starts to communicate with symbols. And we have also those symbols in the theory of validation.
And resolution, I think, is a big issue also for people that are not disoriented at the end of the life. Yeah?
Please, here?
Yeah, I know. I have a slight impairment.
Because we have also, if I understand well, we have also critical voices for validation. So I would like to hear about that critical voices and see, perhaps we will see also some connection.
Okay, and discuss the connections afterwards. Okay. Okay. I'll refer to the. I have found at least 3 researchers that have raised very critical voices about this process of ongoing standardization in palliative care, and I will briefly lead you through this. One is Michaela Fink, who has performed a PhD thesis at our institute, and I owe her a lot of insight in this wonderful discussion about whether it is good or not for the hospice movement that standardization and institutionalization has gone so far. And you might have had this discussion here as well. Michaela Fink showed me in her thesis a piece of empirical work that I only know through her thesis, but which is an interesting piece of work. It's a way of standardizing how bad news should be conveyed to patients through a questionnaire where patients have been asked in which way they would accept bad news better. And there are certain items that have come out from this empirical work, how conveying bad news to patients should be standardized in order for vulnerable people to be more acceptable, to accept this bad news. And it says in this piece of empirical work that the patients said they need a comfortable environment in order to be able to accept bad news. They need the doctor to have plenty of time with the patient. They don't want interruptions of the conversation. They need the doctor to sit very close to the patient, at least as close as Maria and I are sitting now. They need the doctor to prepare them that bad news will follow. Very important. And they need to feel that the doctor is attempting to be empathetic with the patient's experience. They need to feel the empathy of the doctor. So these are brilliant observations, but this doctoral students of ours asks the questions, can you norm and standardize social relations in this way? Can you norm and standardize attitudes and empathy in this way that it is discussed in this empirical work? Or is attitude something you bring about as a person that works with your personality, as a validation teacher or as a palliative care worker? And does it help if you have a recipe, like a cookbook, that says, sit close to the patient, prepare the patient that bad news will follow? And what is the recipe for empathy? Maybe you know it. In the preparation of this input, I couldn't think of any recipe for empathy. That's something you have. That's an attitude you bring about. But how will you standardize empathy?
This is a big connection with validation, because we teach empathy, the attitude, and I think we can teach it. We cannot oblige people to have empathy. But Naomi Fai, when she began her workshop, she says, empathy is defined by what it isn't, more than by what it is. And she always begins like that, and we teach like that. We begin to make the people feel what is not empathy, then after they can be open to experience empathy. And this is a big connection with validation, because the basic attitude in validation is empathy.
I feel like I had the opportunity to observe you when you're wonderfully doing validation, or to listen to Maria when she's trying to teach a little validation to our psychology students at the university in a very brief course. That was too brief. Yeah? And I felt like when you teach empathy, you do it through your example. Am I right? Or is... And when I see these wonderful videos from Naomi, I feel like she's teaching empathy through the whole person that she is, and through the example she gives. But can you standardize Naomi file? Please, yes.
No, of course not. I agree that you cannot standardize empathy or other attitudes. It's not possible, I believe. I think you can help people to develop creativity to be empathetic.
Yes. But that is very close to the original ideas of your founder, Naomi. And I think in the hospice movement we need to get back to the ideas of our original founders. I will ask there are a few more critical ideas. There is the famous sociologist David Clarke, who founded the International Observatory on End-of-Life Care, which is the major research institution in hospice in the UK. And already in the year 2002 he has published this idea, which means that he has expressed it several years before that. By the end of the 1990s, he said that there is a real dilemma in the development of the modern hospice movement, because some people say if the hospice idea will not be integrated into the traditional systems, there will be no success. There will always be unequal access to palliative care. Only the few that are cared for in the hospices will get access to palliative care. So you need to integrate palliative care in all places where people are dying, and this is in 55%. It's the normal ordinary hospital ward. It's the oncology and the internal medicine and the intensive care unit, and you need to integrate palliative care in all these places. But in order to be able to integrate it, you need to standardize it. this is the one side of the dilemma, and the other side is it marks an entry in a risky phase of new development, and this is what David Clark says: early ideals might be compromised through integration of standardized palliative care, because if you standardize it, it is written down in a paper, and it gets away from the original ideas that are spiritual ideas and that have to do with attitudes, and not so much with how many beds per 1 million inhabitants. So this dilemma has been with the hospice movement from the very beginning on. Already Cicely Saunders, whom I introduced you as the first founder of the modern hospice movement, she is quoted that she said, I moved out of the NHS, the National Health System, with my hospice, but I know I need to move in again in order for attitudes to be there, ready for everybody who is in need. So one more, and probably the most critical voice, is the German sociologist Reimer Grönemeyer, who happens to be a good friend of our institute. And he says the hospice movement has undergone a real success story, as I hope I have shown you. It started with 2 revolutionary founders. It started with dying people that were not cared for adequately in the year 1960. And today, it is widely acknowledged in the entire society that we need palliative care. People know what palliative care is. We have national organizations. We have, in Germany and Austria, we have 2 national bodies. We have a hospice body and we have a palliative medicine body. It is legally acknowledged. We have public financing for palliative care and hospice movement. And we have an established medical discipline. We have palliative medicine as an established discipline. So this is in a way a success story. But as Reimer Grönemeyer puts it, it comes with these adjectives. And I want each of these attributes has its own theory. The hospice movement has become medicalized. We have a special medical discipline for the dying people. But we started, as you said, with the statement, dying is a normal process, and everybody needs to be aware of his own and empowered about his own death and dying. But nowadays it's being medicalized and professionalized. It's almost impossible to envision a person dying without a professional in the room. It's not the habit anymore, and it's almost impossible to envision. And with professionalization and medicalization, there comes institutionalization. Like up to 80% in Western European countries die in an institution, in a hospital or in a nursing home. Only 20% die at home. And then it becomes a market, it becomes economized. If there are public financing attributed, there's competition for this public financing. So it becomes economized. So Reimer Grönemeyer asks the question, is it still possible to pursue the original goals of the hospice movement, to enable people to die in dignity and to give mindful and attentive care to the dying people, when at the same time you have a quality control death and dying? Will that still be possible? And when you have a quality control death and dying, that means that you consider dying people not only as dying people, but as clients, as consumers. Some people even go as far as saying dying people are consumers. But if you are a consumer, you have a right to euthanasia. And if you have a right to euthanasia, you soon will be obliged to opt for euthanasia when you're not useful anymore. And this is absolutely contradictory to the original ideals of the hospice movement. So in a way, what Reimer Grönemeyer, who is very critical, diagnosis is that we have moved from a social movement that originally the hospice movement was, a movement that was driven by concerned citizens that volunteered to sit at the bedside of the dying people. And we have moved from this to a specialized field of health and social care. And I think it's a dilemma because there is no way to prevent this. If you feel the social movement is doing any good, you strive for institutionalization. You want everybody to profit from it. And you want resources to be attributed to it. But the more there is money given to the hospice movement, the less there will be volunteering. Yeah. So interestingly enough, the German hospice movement has decided that the hospices, the inpatient hospices in Germany, they will not be 100% financed by public money. There will always be left a margin of 10% financing that will be done through sponsorship and through voluntarily raising money. And I think this is a very wise decision to have this original idea of a social movement built into the stationary hospices. Although, of course, they complain because the hospices say they don't know how to raise the money. And they feel in competition with the hospices for children and with every other source, and now with the refugees. But still, I think it preserves the hospice movement from becoming only a specialized field of professionals. One more idea, and then the last quote. I have one. So I just want to tell you the consequences that Michaela Fink in her PhD thesis sees that come from the success story. She diagnoses that personal initiative in palliative care is undermined because everything is professional. Responsibility is delegated to institutions. Needs are generated artificially because if you can have professional care, you feel like you need to have it. But the hospice movement has started with volunteering and regarding death and dying as a normal process. And if you generate needs artificially, you get growth. There is nothing you can prevent from it. You need more hospice, you need more palliative wards, more professionals, more palliative medical doctors to care for that increased need. And relations are at risk to be standardized. And maybe for the hospice movement, we need to get back to the roots. Maybe doing good palliative care, doing good hospice care is as easy as Elisabeth Kübler-Ross stated it, and this is my last slide. This was a time when they were not gender sensitive, as you might be aware of, because the dying person is a he. Although Elisabeth Kübler-Ross was such a critical and strong woman, it was not the habit to be gender sensitive when you write. So she says, he, the dying person, may want one single person to stop for one single minute, so he can ask one single question. But on the other hand, he will get a dozen people around the clock, all busily preoccupied with his heart rate, his electrocardiogram, and his pulmonary functions. But not with him as a human being. And this was the mission that Elisabeth Kübler-Ross went out for, to change this. And maybe these are the roots we just need to get back. And if we are aware of these roots, maybe we don't need to standardize. These are my reflections. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much for this, because I think it gives some bow now. Do you see bow? Bogen? Yeah? Yes, okay. I think for me it's still working what you have said in me. inspiring me really a lot for searching all those dilemmas, also in thinking about future validation, but this will be a topic in the afternoon. Okay, so I think we should take some questions. Is that okay?
Please, yes.
Thank you, Katharina, for your words. It's very interesting for people who works in validation. And now my question is, what do you think? Which courses of palliative care we in validation need to sensibilize our work? Can you tell us in Austria, in Vienna, what we can do to go in a course to say, okay, now I have heard that many points are good for validation to take in our life.
You mean educational courses?
Yes.
Yes. Is your question if you need if there is palliative care education that is useful for validation workers? What?
Yes, and maybe what can we do to go in a course? Also welchen Kurs würden Sie uns empfehlen, uns zu sensibilisieren mit diesem Thema, Verbindungen zu bauen?
Yeah, well, one thing is...
Bring connections.
Yeah.
In English, please. To translate it in English to the connections.
To bring about connections between palliative care and validation. Well, one thing... I mean, I can tell you something about education and courses in palliative care. I'll be happy to do so, but the preliminary remark would be that Marina Koya says palliative care is there's three very important things in palliative care. The first thing is communication. The second thing is communication, and the third thing is communication. So in a way we're at the same side, because isn't that, I feel this is true for validation as well. It's about communication, communication and communication, verbally and non-verbally. What I think is might be the weakness of palliative care is that it's very much concentrated on verbal communication. This is very important to communicate through words in palliative care. And what we can really learn and need to integrate into the palliative care concept is to learn to communicate on an emotional level and on a non-verbal level, through touch and through looking at the person, singing with her. So there's a lot we can learn. And if you want to be sensitized for the concept of palliative care, there is several possibilities. There is with a special emphasis on palliative geriatrics. This is palliative care for the very old people. There is a curriculum that is that was developed originally by the German Robert Bosch Stiftung, and then it was developed further by Marina Koya. And this is a 5 days curriculum where there's a storyline method, and you follow a person that enters the nursing home from the moment she enters the nursing home until her death in a 5 days course, and you learn everything that is important to be a good carer in the palliative care sense of way for this person. And this training is now performed by the Dachverband Hospiz, the Austrian Dachverband Hospiz, in I think 50, 70 or 120 nursing homes in Austria, a lot of nursing homes in Austria. So you can always find a nursing home close to you where this training is taking place.
And Marina Koya, she's also a validation worker, level 1.
Yeah.
That's why.
Yeah, she's a person at the intersection between palliative care and validation.
Yeah. And in this course, which is called in German Palliative Praxis, There is a module with validation in it.
Yeah, and this module is there because the course was developed by Marina Groyer. Yeah. Are you a moderator of Palliative Praxis?
Yes.
Okay, so you're also a person at the intersection. Oh, danke, Maria. Yeah. And then, of course, as you can imagine, education is also standardized in palliative care, and there are these interdisciplinary courses that are 4 times 4 days and are taking place, I think, now in each Bundesland in Austria. So 16 days of standardized course, interdisciplinary course, that is very valuable because you learn how to communicate about palliative care with other professions. So I can recommend these kind of courses very much, and I think there's in every Bundesland now there's one kind of this course.
Yeah, okay. Katja?
Yes, I want to, I think, listening to you, and it's really interesting, and I want also to thank you for all this support and all the door you are opening for us. And I would like to say about validation, because you said we are more trained of the abilities to communicate verbally, and we have to communicate non-verbally. And I think one of the things very important that now EVA brought to us is empathy, because this attitude helps the carers, the people, to risk the non-verbal communication, because I think the non-verbal communication is something that we know very well. We know that very well with children, with babies. But with old people or with people dying, there's something else that is touched in us. And empathy gives us the possibility to separate. It's not my experience, it's the experience of the other, but I can be with this person in this experience. And I think really teach empathy is, for me, in my experience of teacher, but also of, I am a physical therapist, and I always work in geriatric in a hospital, and in my experience, it's really this attitude that helps the carer to be able to sit, to accompany, to be with the person. And just to end, I now teach the people a sentence from Gandhi. You know the man Gandhi?
Mahatma Gandhi.
Yeah, Mahatma Gandhi. And he said, when you do something for me, if you do it without me, you do it against me. And I think this sentence is really the bridge between palliative care and what we do with validation. And if we have that in mind, then the attitude is really the most important to be able to accompany those people.
Very beautiful, because you also say that the empathy is for the carer. I think this is very important, because some people say that empathy makes the carer too vulnerable, and then if the carers are empathetic, they get hurt. And there is interesting research that says the opposite is true. If you are empathetic, as a carer, you are protected against being hurt.
Yeah. Yeah.
Excuse me, may I say something?
I want to just say something about that, because we began, not us, but we began a research on that to the carers, and it's ongoing, so we don't have the result, but the results are very encouraging in this way. We give a questionnaire that comes from university to the carers that begin the basic course, and at the end of the basic course, 8 months later, they will have the same questionnaire, and the first answer begin to come. We will have the result next year, I think, but we have now the researcher, not we, has 800 carers who answered those questionnaires, and the first result says what you are saying, that carers are protected by using empathy, and they can do their work better, and there's not so much burnout when you use empathy.
Maria, please. Yeah, thank you.
I just want to say something because of you searching connections between palliative care and especially non-verbally techniques or something to raise that. I think what is very important in validation for difference could be that to getting empathy is also in contact and always connected to take the behavior of a person as a guideline to find communication ways. Yeah. So I think Naomi is saying that very clear. We are watching the behavior, and we can videotype behavior. We can describe behavior. Yeah, you see, when I'm closing my eyes, I can describe. Yeah, it doesn't mean what I cannot say what it means. This is interpretation, and validation is no interpretation. It is just taking the behavior of a person, how the breathing is and so on, as a guideline, and on this guideline we can learn to develop empathy. Yeah, because you see exactly what happens when empathy is not working, then you get this, or, yeah? And you can really watch that, and you can analyze videos, for instance, and this is also one basic thing in validation documentation and also giving feedback to courses, is to see those videos and analyze it and giving feedback, because if I am in video, I build up a video self. This is also scientific.
Thank you very much. Yes, please.
Hi, okay. Boris? Yes, I would like to point out again your topic of the ethical problem of autonomy and caring for disoriented people. Because as it is for me as a validation worker, I often have the experience that people during the first phase of disorientation, they are fighting for her autonomy on the one side, and on the other side, they are in some situations they aren't in a situation to come to a decision, but it is a very important decision for quality of their life, and they can't do it anymore. And again, I have the experience in Vienna, for example, with the Fonds Soziales Wien, that they are persons, they are home carers, they are trained in, you have to get your own decision. You're an autonomous person, and it is your right, it is your human right to decide if you want any care or if you don't want any care. And I think this is a process in sort of this whole disorientation, becoming disorientated. We would need much more focus on that. It is not so easy. Yes, you are autonomous or you are not autonomous, but there are some phases you are. There are some there's some time during the day you are in the morning, maybe you are at lunch, and in the afternoon, in the late afternoon, you aren't. And so there is much more, I think, precise looking, precise watching, and it is not so easy. Thank you.
Yeah, this is beautiful, because precise looking and watching is a way of engaging in relationship. So in order to enable people for living their autonomy. As you said, as you put it, you need to watch closely and precisely, and this in itself is already engaging in relationship. So there's always, autonomy is only possible if there is, at the same time, there is relationship. And I think this means that we cannot declare autonomy as the most important value in validation or in palliative care. I think that leads us into real troubles.
Yes. I think, I think the other principle of welfare has to come more in focus again. Yes, we are responsible for the welfare. We cannot say, okay, let us see. Maybe she will come to a decision, or maybe she will not. So no, we are responsible for the welfare too. Thank you.
I do absolutely agree, and I think this is a trap we should not step into. And it is overreacting, maybe, from what we have witnessed for too long, that people in hospital could not decide anything at all. And of course, that as a reaction, autonomy was emphasized. But I think it is overreacted now. And I want to emphasize again, it yields to a euthanasia debate. If you're only on the side of autonomy, you get euthanasia. And this is something that I consider to be really dangerous for us as a society as a whole. To legalize euthanasia is really very, very dangerous. We can see that from the countries where it is legalized. You get a lot of people that have not consented in euthanasia, but they do get it at that are not able of consenting at the moment where euthanasia takes place. There is a lot of research that proves that. So this is really dangerous. And legalizing euthanasia means putting a pressure on people to opt for euthanasia. And I think we need to, as palliative care people and as validation people, we need to prevent that there is put pressure on disoriented old people to opt for euthanasia. It's not a good solution.